TRANSLIT, complete language solutions.
I will be talking about future of interpreting, and I put this slide on purpose because it's inspiring, and I think at this difficult time of the world, we need a little bit of light and a little bit of inspiration and motivation. For some of you who don't know what TRANSLIT does and you've never dealt with us before, I'll just give a very quick overview of the company. We are based in Ireland. We've been a classical language service provider for 10 years. We've always been focusing on the interpreting. Like many other agencies, we do translation, localization services, but interpreting has been our focus. We have 2 ISO certifications, and as of last November in 2019, we actually launched an interpreting management platform, which is a marketplace and a tool for translators, interpreters, agencies to work together. It has quite many useful features. I'll just run very quickly through them. Interpreting booking, scheduling, calendar sync. It's a CRM system to manage interpreting projects and interpreters, invoicing, profit calculation, messaging system, payouts, and security. So whether you're an interpreter or a language service provider, you're welcome to register. So enough about TRANSLIT. Let's talk of where we are at the moment. And since 21st of March, many companies and countries have actually closed their borders and sent people home. And we as interpreters are actually seeing empty conferences, we're seeing empty streets, and that affected us personally. There is a lot of speculation of what may happen next. I just put this slide to show you that there's many scenarios how good or how bad things can escalate. We're not going to spend time to actually go through those scenarios, but we hope that one of the good ones will actually realize. When is going to happen, when things will get back to normal, as many of us are saying, we don't know. But what I'd like to say that probably we're not going to see normality coming back. It's going to be just a new reality. We have to learn, we have to probably adapt and change some new skills. So without speculating, what impact COVID-19 had on industries, especially the language industry. On the left column, as you can see, I put some of the sectors that got affected most, and they included anybody with gatherings of people, essentially. So it's travel, tourism, hotels, shops, such as offline retail, logistics, supply chain, sports and events, construction, manufacturing, and of course, on-site interpreting. We at TRANSLIT, we saw pretty much all of our on-site interpreting bookings canceled. On the other side, some other industries are actually thriving at these times. Telecoms and conference tools, the one we are using right now for our event, Zoom, is thriving. They got more sales between January and March than they did last year, essentially in this first quarter. They're thriving. The online and entertainment and gaming are also booming. Online e-commerce, again, Amazon just announced that hiring 100,000 people. There was the first hiring round. Now they're getting another 70,000 people hired because essentially they cannot cope with the demand. Home delivery services, healthcare and pharma, of course, they're also now working on the medicine. Online education and learning, people are selling more courses now than they did before. And the last but not the least is remote interpreting. That's the trend we are seeing right now. I'm not sure if you came across this, but there was an official research done in China on the 27th of February, and it was done in Beijing Language and Culture Institute. So they already managed, between January and February, they conducted a survey of all the language service providers in China. And they, at that time, they showed already 62% decline. What we're seeing now is probably 95% decline in the on-site interpreting. And that's the reality. So what we're going to do now, are we going to sit and just wait until we are allowed back in courts, until we are allowed back in those business meetings, or do we actually try something new? We try to consider remote interpreting. And that's why we are actually doing this webinar. So before talking about future of interpreting, I want to very briefly touch on the history of interpreting. The first reference to the word interpreting actually came out about 3,000 years ago, and it was in Egypt in one of the prince tombs. That was the first reference to interpreter. let's fast forward to the recent term, when actually the first remote interpreting came out to life. It started in 1957, but it was, just trying things out when the phone systems were working, when the sign interpreting came out, when the television came out, and it was up until late 1973 when the first government, it was actually an Australian Immigration Service, they adopted phone interpreting systems. Then starting from 1990, we've seen video remote interpreting coming up, but it wasn't until really 2000 when it began to become widely adopted by different state bodies and businesses. And the popularity actually came out after 2011. The term on-demand interpreting kicked in about 2014. Then when the companies such as Interprefy appeared, and there was a couple of other American and Australian companies. And what we see that Europe is a little bit lagging behind, but it's actually Australia, Canada, and United States that are taking the lead of on-demand video and remote interpreting. They're kind of leading by example. And just 2 years ago, in 2018, we started seeing actual standards for distant interpreting and remote interpreting. Up until 2018, people were trying it, companies were providing remote services, but there was no really a set of guidelines. So in 2018, we started seeing those guidelines published by different official organizations such as International Association of Consular Interpreters and Council of Language Access Coordinators. And we are seeing now distance interpreting also adding in the next ISO standards for interpreting services. So this slide illustrates kind of how the remote interpreter progressed. First, we had TV when we had a sign interpreter on the screen. Then we had an introduction of booth with the connection to phone systems, with connection to video. Then we've seen these devices and iPads being distributed to some of the hospitals. And recently we are seeing now actual mobile devices being used for the remote interpreting. So why remote interpreting actually gain in popularity? COVID-19 just helped to accelerate this process. But businesses and state bodies have been looking at remote interpreting for a while. Of course, it's saving time and money. And if you dig it a little bit more, there is no travel cost involved. We interpreters, we spend sometimes more time getting to an assignment and coming back from it rather than the actual doing assignment. With remote interpreting, there is no need for expensive equipment. When you're looking at it, some distant locations, they may not have actual access to interpreters on the ground. But if it's done remotely, the interpreter can connect from any location in the world. Right now, we have people from pretty much, I don't know how many, 20 countries, different countries joining us. And that is actually possible after 2011. Before that, people wouldn't have the freedom of actually joining online events. It's 24/7, so interpreter could join from Asia or China or down Africa during the daylight. So even if the event happens at night, the interpreter could join from another country. And of course, it's fast and on demand. Hospitals had issues in the past when they had to call interpreters and they would take 2 hours to get to a location. Now they can press a button and somebody would join within seconds, if not minutes. And as you can see, this little message, we got it from one of our interpreters who just came in from a local police. We call police Garda in Ireland. And he refused to attend further assignments because there was no safety rules in place. Police doesn't have enough protective equipment. And that's what we see now. So safety is actually another thing why remote interpreting can be adopted at these times. So what is common in terms of remote interpreting? We've seen devices, iPads, but this is a picture that probably illustrates of what may happen in the next couple of years. Virtual reality is gaining a lot of popularity and people are immersing themselves. It's probably not going to happen within the next 2-3 years, but it's a trend that in addition to the picture, we're going to have the actual interpreting coming through the audio. This screen talks a little bit more. Now, one of the computer games is actually started adding guided tours inside the computer game. So it's no longer just a person playing, a game themselves. There could be an interpreter joining a virtual reality game with the participant and playing the game along them, you know, and it's already happening right now. This year at the Consumer Electronics Show, there was virtual companions release. Who actually, you know, can you put in a comment a little plus who is following Computer Electronics Show? Just out of curiosity, if you can type in plus if you've been watching this this presentation, so I get idea of who knows about it and who doesn't. Okay, so while you're putting plus, so essentially what we saw this year, it's the virtual human beings. So it's people who are actually mimicking the speech, mimicking the gestures, emotions of real humans, and they're already doing it. So what we probably will see in the future is news presented by a virtual person. There's no need for a TV presenter sitting in front of the camera and reading out news. We're going to see more robots doing it essentially, and they will be looking completely like real humans. And imagine this, if all news could be pre-recorded, there is no need to interpret it anymore. So companies who are actually have complete scripts for their events, what they may do, they may just pre-record it and use virtual human beings who would look 99% real, actually presenting, and at the same time presenting it in multiple languages, and they just pay for the software to actually do it without having to have an interpreter on their event. If it's completely pre-recorded and there's no need for real-to-real interaction, they may just use essentially virtual human being instead of interpreter. So that's one of the risks for interpreters of, you know, losing some of the pre-recorded events. This is another interesting thing. Streaming becomes really, really popular these days. And the interpreting for streamers isn't something that really kicked in, but we probably will see it. YouTube streamers, Instagram streamers are actually now approaching interpreting companies and asking to collaborate with them. The technology wasn't really there to help it, but we're going to see it. And I'm telling you, it's going to be coming in 2020. If it's not happening this year, next year, we're going to see more streamers using interpreting services added. And this particular slide actually mentions Chinese farmers are already being encouraged to stream to boost their sales. We're talking about social media, popularity stars, but even farmers already streaming. So it's going to be maybe another year before we see interpreters joining the streaming community. Some of you already probably seen this device. It's actually an automated interpreter. So the way the current automated interpreting works is that it converts speech to text, then it does the machine translation, and then it reads it aloud back. And some of the translators said that Google Translate and machine translation will never replace their work, but we already see that actual machine translation sometimes does a better job than the actual translator. Unfortunately, that is actually happening, and it happened maybe a little bit sooner than translators predicted. The interpreting industry says it's going to be too long before the quality of this will be on an adequate level. But these devices are already being used by hotels. They're already being used by some travelers to actually interpret without the need of interpreter. And maybe another 2 years, but the quality will become so good that it may be acceptable at the generic level. It may not be accepted in courts or in medical practitioners, but it may actually replace some of our jobs where a generic vocabulary is needed for something trivial. And this is something that I would like to speculate. It's my pretty much last slide of this presentation, the thought-to-thought interpreting. In 2014, some scientists already managed to transmit thoughts. So without having to actually convert this speech to audio and to text and convert it back, people were able to communicate thought to thought. So imagine this, if the language at some stage becomes irrelevant, if a person manages to capture the thought and transfer it to another human without actually a need of the language in between. I mean, it's already being tested. We don't know how long it's going to take, but probably some company will invent a device that we could connect at the back of our ear, think about something and decide whom to transmit that thought, and the language will not be even spoken. That's a risk again for us. But at the same time, it's just interesting to see that the world is changing so fast, and it's actually affecting the interpreting community. So, you know, if you're hoping to get back to the same state where we were 3 months ago, it most likely is not going to happen. So we now need to learn new skills. We need to adapt, and remote interpreting is the first step.
TRANSLIT, complete language solutions.